November 6th, 1956, a Tuesday. In a secure room beneath Whitehall, 6 men sat around a mahogany table. They were looking at a single piece of paper. The paper contained 3 numbers, 3 simple numbers that would end 200 years of British global dominance in the span of a single conversation. The first number was sterling reserves, the second was military cost per day, the third was American pressure. By the time they left that room, they knew. The British Empire, the empire where the sun never set, the empire that controlled a quarter of Earth's landmass, was over. The decision they made that day would force Britain to withdraw from the Suez Canal, to abandon its military presence east of Suez, to watch the pound sterling lose its status as the world's reserve currency, to become a secondary power. But here's what keeps me up at night. I'm looking at America's numbers right now, and I'm seeing the same 3 numbers. Different decade, different empire, same pattern. Welcome. For the next 40 minutes, I'm going to show you something the establishment doesn't want you to see. Not because it's conspiracy theory, because but because it's documented historical fact. I'm going to show you how empires die, and why America just entered the same death spiral that collapsed Britain in 30 years. The year 2026 might be our Suez moment. Let's begin. To understand where America is heading, we need to understand exactly how Britain fell. Not the textbook version, the real version. Mistake number 1, the debt trap. August 15th, 1945. World War II ends. Britain has won. But victory came with a price tag. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio, 238%. To put that in perspective, that's like owing $238,000 when you only make $100,000 a year. But we're not talking about thousands. We're talking about the entire GDP of the 6th largest economy on Earth. Britain went to America, hat in hand. They needed a loan. The amount, $375 billion from the US, $1.2 billion from Canada. The terms? Brutal. 2% interest rate, which sounds reasonable until you realize Britain had just saved the world from fascism and America was now charging interest on that salvation. But here's the killer clause buried in the agreement. Britain had to make the pound sterling fully convertible to dollars within 1 year. They had to abandon their currency controls. They had to open their markets. The British negotiator, John Maynard Keynes, you might have heard of him, called it an economic Dunkirk. He died of a heart attack 6 months later. Mistake number 2. Imperial overstretch. Britain in 1950 still had military presence in India and Pakistan until 1947, Palestine until 1948, Malaya, fighting communist insurgency, Kenya, Mau Mau uprising, Cyprus, independence movement, Egypt, Suez Canal, Jordan, Iraq, and the entire Middle East, Hong Kong. That's military bases, personnel, ships, aircraft, and administrative costs across 70-plus countries. The cost? In 1950, Britain was spending 7 to 8% of GDP on defense. Today, that sounds normal, but remember, they're doing this while drowning in debt from World War II. It's like you're drowning in credit card debt, but instead of cutting back, you're paying for security guards in 70 different cities. You're not living there, you're just paying to maintain presence. Why? Because that's what empires do. They can't imagine not being everywhere. The psychology of dominance becomes a trap. Mistake number 3, ignoring the rising power. In 1945, America's GDP was larger than Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. Britain didn't just have a rival, they had a successor. But British politicians kept pretending this was temporary, that somehow the special relationship meant America would preserve British interests. They were wrong. Now here's where it gets interesting. These 3 mistakes, debt trap, imperial overstretch, ignoring the rising power, they didn't collapse Britain overnight. There was a moment, a single crystallizing moment where everyone suddenly realized the empire was over. That moment was Suez, 1956. But before we get there, let me show you America's numbers, because when you see them side by side, you'll understand why I'm calling 2026 America's Suez moment. Let's talk about debt, real debt, the kind that destroys empires. Britain, 1945. Debt-to-GDP ratio of 238% United States. 2026, debt-to-GDP ratio of 122% and climbing. You might be thinking, well, that's not as bad. You're right, it's not as bad. It's worse. Here's why. Britain's debt in 1945, mostly domestic holders, British citizens, incurred fighting an existential war, Nazis, sterling still reserve currency for now, manufacturing base intact young population entering workforce colonies, still generating revenue. America's debt in 2026, 30% foreign holders, China, Japan, others who can sell, incurred through tax cuts, unfunded programs, and forever wars. Dollar reserve status being actively challenged. Manufacturing gutted and outsourced aging population leaving workforce. No colonial revenue, just expensive military presence. See the difference? Britain's debt was from winning World War II. America's debt is from everything and everyone for decades with no end in sight. U.S. national debt, $34.8 trillion annual deficit. $1.7 trillion interest payments alone, $880 billion per year. That's more than the defense budget. America is now paying more in interest on debt than it spends on its entire military. Let that sink in. But here's what really matters, the trajectory. Britain's debt peaked in 1945, and then they couldn't reduce it fast enough. By 1976, just 31 years later, they needed an IMF bailout. The pound lost 60% of its value. They became a secondary power. America's debt is accelerating. $5.6 trillion 2008, $10 trillion 2020, $27 trillion 2024, $34 trillion 2026, projected 36 to $37 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office, not some conspiracy theorist, the actual government agency, projects U.S. debt will hit 180% of GDP by 2050. But empires don't wait for 2050. There's always a trigger moment, a crisis where everyone suddenly realizes the emperor has no clothes. For Britain, it was Suez. For America, keep watching. Now let me show you something that should terrify every economist. When Britain's debt was 238% in 1945, interest rates were under government control. They kept them at 2.5%. Today, the Federal Reserve has less control than you think. If global markets lose confidence, if foreign holders start selling treasury bonds, rates could spike. Every 1% increase in interest rates adds $350 billion to America's annual debt payments. If rates hit 7-8% like they did in the 1980s, America's interest payments alone would consume 40% of all tax revenue. You can't run an empire when 40% of your tax revenue goes to interest payments. You can't fund the military. You can't maintain infrastructure. You can't provide services. You become Britain in 1976, begging the IMF for help. But debt alone doesn't collapse empires. It's what you're spending the debt on that matters. Which brings us to America's second fatal mistake. In 1950, Britain had military presence in 70-plus countries. In 2026, America has military presence in over 750 locations across 80-plus countries. Let me show you the math. U.S. military presence, 50-plus. Overseas military bases, 170,000-plus. Active troops stationed abroad. Naval operations in 7 fleet areas covering every Ocean Air Force operations on 6 continents. Special operations in 80-plus countries. Military aid to 100-plus nations. Annual cost, defense budget, $877 billion official. Veterans Affairs, $300 billion intelligence agencies, $80 billion estimated. Homeland Security, $60 billion nuclear weapons maintenance, $50 billion debt from past wars. That's 6% of GDP on military-related spending. Britain in 1950, 7-8% of GDP on defense. America in 2026, 6% plus of GDP on defense. Spot the parallel? But here's what makes it worse. Britain was defending actual territory, colonies that generated revenue. India alone contributed $1.3 billion to the British war effort in World War II. America is defending, what exactly? Germany? They're our biggest economic competitor in Europe. Japan? They're building their own military now. South Korea? Samsung competes with Apple. The Middle East? For oil we're increasingly not dependent on. We're spending $1.5 trillion per year to maintain a global military presence that increasingly serves no economic interest. Let me tell you about a concept called Imperial overstretch. The term was coined by historian Paul Kennedy in 1987. The pattern is always the same. Stage 1, empire expands military during period of economic dominance. Stage 2, military commitments continue even as economic dominance fades. Stage 3, defense spending crowds out domestic investment. Stage 4, rising powers exploit empires' overextension. Stage 5, crisis forces sudden retrenchment, collapse. Britain went through all 5 stages from 1945 to 1976. America is currently in stage 4. Let me prove it. U.S. education ranking, 13th globally. China graduating engineers annually, 1.4 million U.S. graduating engineers annually, 250,000 U.S. R&D spending, 3.2% of GDP China R&D spending, 2.8% of GDP, but catching up fast. While America spends $1.5 trillion maintaining bases in Germany, China builds the infrastructure of the future. While we patrol the South China Sea, they build the ports that will dominate 21st century trade. This is exactly what happened with Britain. 1950s, Britain. spending billions defending Malaya against communists. 1950s, America, building the interstate highway system. 2020s, America, spending billions on forever wars. 2020s, China, building Belt and Road Initiative. The rising power invests at home. The declining empire defends abroad. This pattern has repeated for 2,000 years. Now, here's the question that should haunt every American. If we can afford to maintain this presence, if the debt keeps growing, if China keeps rising, what's our Suez moment? What's the crisis that forces us to admit we're no longer the sole superpower? Before I answer that, you need to understand the third parallel. Let's talk about the ultimate power, reserve currency status. A reserve currency is money that other countries hold as part of their foreign exchange reserves. It's the money they use for international trade, the money they trust to hold value. For 200 years, that was the British pound sterling. After 1944, it was the American dollar. Reserve currency status is the closest thing to a superpower cheat code. You can print money to pay your debts. Other countries can't. Global demand for your currency keeps its value high. You set global interest rates effectively. Your corporations dominate international trade. Your banks control the global financial system. You can weaponize currency access, sanctions. Britain had this power for 2 centuries. They thought it would last forever. Let me tell you how fast it ended. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement made the dollar the primary reserve, still backed by gold, and the pound still a secondary reserve currency. In 1947, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30% due to a debt crisis. In the 1950s, global trade increasingly conducted in dollars, not pounds. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, America threatened to dump the pound sterling unless Britain withdrew. Britain complied, and the world realized the dollar was king and the pound was subordinate. In 1967, there was another pound devaluation, this time by 14% overnight. By 1976, the IMF had to bail out Britain, and the pound completely lost its reserve currency status. It took just 32 years, from 1944 to 1976, for the world's dominant currency to become irrelevant. 1 generation. Now let's look at the dollar. In 1999, the euro was introduced, giving alternatives. In 2008, the financial crisis shook global trust in the dollar. In 2014, Russia began moving away from the dollar after sanctions. In 2016, China launched the petrol yuan. In 2020, the Fed printed $4 trillion in response to COVID, raising inflation concerns. In 2022, the Russia-Ukraine war saw the dollar weaponized through swift sanctions. In 2023, BRICS discussed a common currency, and by 2024, Saudi Arabia didn't renew its petrodollar agreement. In 2025, de-dollarization accelerated. In 2000, the dollar accounted for 71% of global reserves. By 2010, it was 62%, and by 2020, 59%. By 2024, it's down to 58%. It's happening slowly, then suddenly. The pattern is identical to sterling's decline. But here's what's different and worse. When sterling fell, there was one clear alternative: the dollar. When the dollar falls, there are multiple alternatives: the euro, the yuan, gold, Bitcoin crypto, and the BRICS currency basket. A multipolar currency world is far more unstable than a bipolar transition. Britain handed the crown to America peacefully. America won't hand the crown to anyone, and China won't take it peacefully. This brings us to the most dangerous parallel of all. October 29th, 1956, Israel invades Egypt. Britain and France join the invasion under the pretext of separating Israeli and Egyptian forces. The real reason? Egypt's President Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal, and Britain couldn't accept losing control of the world's most strategic waterway. The canal connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, the shortcut for British oil from the Middle East, for trade with India and Asia. Controlling Suez meant controlling global commerce. Britain sent paratroopers. France sent jets. They thought it would be quick. They were right about that. It ended in just 6 days, not because Egypt defeated them militarily, but because of a single phone call. Dwight Eisenhower, U.S. President, called British Prime Minister Anthony Eden. The conversation was brief. Withdraw from Suez, or we will destroy the pound sterling. Eisenhower wasn't bluffing. The U.S. Treasury began selling British pounds. Sterling collapsed. Britain's reserves drained in hours. Eden had a choice: keep the canal and lose the currency, or withdraw and save the pound. He withdrew. 6 days later, British troops left Egypt. The empire that had lasted 200 years effectively ended in a week. Now, here's the question I've been building to. What S America S Suez moment? Where's the flashpoint where everyone suddenly realizes American power is constrained, that the empire can't enforce its will anymore? I see 3 candidates. Option 1, Taiwan. If China moves on Taiwan, America faces a choice: intervene militarily, risk World War III, massive casualties, potential nuclear exchange, or don't intervene and admit publicly that American security guarantees are hollow. If America doesn't defend Taiwan after decades of saying it would, every ally questions U.S. commitment. Japan, South Korea, NATO suddenly wonder if American protection means anything. That's a Suez moment. Option 2. Saudi Arabia joins BRICS, petroleum. If Saudi Arabia officially abandons dollar-exclusive oil sales and accepts yuan, euros, and gold for oil, the petrodollar system collapses. Global dollar demand craters. Inflation spikes in the U.S. The Fed can't control it without massive rate hikes that trigger depression. That's a Suez moment. Option 3. Debt crisis, Treasury auction failure. If foreign holders start selling U.S. Treasuries en masse, with China, Japan, and others dumping bonds, an auction could fail, and the U.S. government might not be able to sell its debt at reasonable rates. Interest rates would spike to 7-8%, and debt payments could consume 40% of tax revenue. The government would face a choice: default, unthinkable, or print money, leading to hyperinflation. That's a Suez moment. Any of these could happen in 2026, 2027, or 2030. The point isn't predicting the exact date. The point is understanding that when empires fall, there's always a single clarifying moment when everyone simultaneously realizes the power is gone. Now, for Britain, it took 6 days in 1956. For America, it will take 6 hours on social media. But there's a fourth factor Britain never had to deal with, something that makes America's situation even more unstable. When Britain declined, there was one rising power: America. When America declines, there are 5 rising powers organized into a coalition: BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And as of 2024, they've invited Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Argentina. That's 11 countries representing 46% of the global population, 37% of global GDP, PPP, 43% of global oil production, major holders of U.S. debt, and combined military capability that rivals NATO. Britain never faced an organized counterbloc. The Soviet Union existed, yes, but Stalin wasn't coordinating with India, Brazil, and South Africa to replace the pound sterling. BRICS is explicitly trying to replace the dollar. De-dollarization isn't a conspiracy theory. It's official policy in multiple countries. When China builds alternatives, India builds alternatives. When India builds alternatives, Brazil builds alternatives. And when everyone builds alternatives, the dollar's reserve status evaporates. This is exactly what happened to sterling in the 1950s and 60s. Countries started holding more dollars, just in case, then just in case became primarily, and then primarily became exclusively. By 1976, no one held pounds as reserves anymore. The dollar is currently in the just-in-case phase of decline. Countries are reducing dollar reserves from 71% to 58%, not abandoning it completely yet, just diversifying, just building alternatives, just in case. But just in case is how empires end, not with a bang, with 1,000 small decisions that suddenly add up to a new world order. Let's talk about the future. 3 possible scenarios for America as empire between now and 2035. I'm going to be blunt. None of them involve America maintaining sole superpower status. That ship has sailed. The question is how we manage the decline. Scenario 1, manage decline, the optimistic path. America does what Britain should have done in 1945. Accept reality early and manage the transition. Gradual reduction in military presence, close 400-plus unnecessary bases. Negotiate a multilateral world order with China, the EU, and India. Focus defense spending on the hemisphere, America's, not the globe. Redirect military budgets toward infrastructure, education, and R&D. Accept a multipolar currency system. The dollar is first among equals, not dominant. Pay down debt gradually through spending discipline. Probability, 15%. Why so low? Because it requires political courage America hasn't shown. It requires admitting we're not number one anymore. Britain couldn't do it. What makes us think America can? Scenario 2, chaotic decline, the likely path. America does what Britain actually did. Deny reality until forced by crisis. A major crisis, Taiwan, debt, Suez equivalent, forces sudden realization. There's a rapid, disorderly withdrawal from global commitments. The dollar loses reserve status over 10 to 15 years, faster than sterling's 30. Domestic political chaos, protests, instability, blame shifting. Standard of living drops 20 to 30% as import costs spike. Regional powers fill the vacuum. China and Asia, the EU and Europe, chaos in the Middle East. America becomes a major power, but not the power. Probability? 65%. This is how empires usually decline. Not through planning, but through crisis. Not gradually, but suddenly. Remember, Britain went from the Suez Crisis in 1956 to an IMF bailout in 1976. 20 years of chaos. Scenario 3, conflict escalation, the nightmare path. America does what declining empires sometimes do, fight to preserve status. There's military confrontation with China over Taiwan or the South China Sea. Economic warfare escalates. Sanctions, trade wars, currency wars. The dollar weaponization pushes more countries to brics. A spiral of escalation as both sides feel threatened.